right, the last lecture on Chapter 3, we're going to look at immigration and reform. And a lot of this, again, it has a lot of sectional rivalries are involved in here. And behind the background picture is a picture kind of portraying the Underground Railroad. And we'll talk about that toward the end. That's a part of the reform movement. Immigration is becoming a big issue. Now, immigration has always been a big issue, and it's like people like to say today, America is a country of immigrants, and there's a lot of truth to that. But we're looking at a new wave of immigration in the early 1800s, and as the U.S. changed, as we grew, so did the people in the culture, and a lot of that had to do with immigration. In the mid-1800s, you've got immigrants coming in from around the world. Okay, and a lot of this is due to the Industrial Revolution. We become industrialized, and so jobs are created, and it's one of the major pull factors into the United States even today. People come here for opportunity, and a lot more opportunity existed in the United States because of that Industrial Revolution than you could get in a lot of places in Europe. Two major groups that came in large numbers were the Irish and the Germans. And you can look at how differently they're treated, and a lot of that has to do with where they settle and their purpose for coming. A lot of the Irish came because of the potato famine in the 1840s, and the potato famine meant that that was their biggest source of food. And when they weren't producing enough to survive, people died of starvation, and so they began to look at moving, and so they're going to come to the United States. Most of those who came were poor. They were uneducated. They do speak English, which is going to be a problem later, but they do speak English. But they're also Catholic, and there is still at this time a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States, a lot of discrimination against Catholics. The Irish are going to settle in northeastern cities, and they're going to work as laborers or domestics. What this means is job competition, and job competition tends to lead to depressed wages, and so a lot of people are going to look unfavorably on the Irish migration. And you see a lot of Irish influences even still today in northeastern cities, primarily places like Boston. A lot of Irish moved into the New England area and became very prominent there over time. Germans got a lot going on there too, poverty, but also a revolution in 1848. And this is going to drive a lot of people out. So that's a push factor. Push means what pushes you out and what pulls you in. So push is pushing you out of somewhere, and pulling you in is a reason to move to a country. They're not looking so much at this point. I'm not saying always. They're not looking so much at industrial jobs, though a lot do move into the cities. A lot of them want to settle in the Midwest for land, a lot of inexpensive land, and they can come into the United States and buy this land and farm there. And you can see a lot of German influences in the West, a lot of Oktoberfests and beer festivals that are out there, a lot of German towns. Memphis, Tennessee, of all places, they have a German town. And so you can see places where they move into with the promise of that inexpensive land and the opportunity to farm and to become successful that way. The problem then, as we see today, is that Americans aren't overly fond of immigrants. We can make the arguments for and against immigration, but it doesn't change the fact that Americans tend to disapprove, and not always fear, but just disapprove. We can go back to John Adams' administration and the Alien and Sedition Acts that he's going to pass, and that's going to lead to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Anyway, in this case, we're looking at an economic reason for not supporting immigration. Again, like I just said, the more people who come in, they take our jobs and they lower pay. There's going to be a new party that forms as a result of this. It's the American Party, but people call them the Know Nothing Party, and a lot of that was because it was secret. What they talked about was secret, and so when you would ask them, "Well, what do y'all stand for? What did y'all talk about at your meeting?" The response would be, "I know nothing." So they were known as the Know Nothing Party. They were anti-Catholic. They did not like the Irish mostly because of that, but also they began to call for a longer naturalization period. In other words, they had to live in the United States longer before they could apply for citizenship. And they also wanted to ban foreigners from holding public office. And a lot of places actually specified banning Catholics from holding public office. So that's what nativism is. And we'll talk about nativism again in chapter 5 and quite a few times throughout the class. Second Great Awakening happens in the 30s through 40s, but the whole movement itself was the 20s through the 60s. So it's a pretty good little time period that it happens. But this is a religious movement. You've got a lot of traveling preachers who are preaching the word, and they actually they're preaching about helping society, and I don't know, I'm trying to say this, but you need to use your time, you need to use your talents to make society a better place. And so it's going to kind of spark quite a few of these of the reform movements. And we're only going to talk about a couple, but I'm going to list more than that. The temperance movement, this is trying to moderate alcohol consumption. Now, as we move forward, they're going to want to ban it. But at this point, they're just looking at moderating alcohol because they see alcohol as a reason for some of society's ills, poverty, abuse, violence. Prison reform movement. This is led by Dorothea Dix. Our prisons were crazy places. And I'm not saying jail is a place you want to go today, but the jails prior to prison reform were horrific. The mentally ill were placed into prisons. So really this leads also to mental health reform too, I guess you could say. It also leads to the juvenile justice system. Kids who committed crimes are put into big people jails. You're 11, 12, and you kill somebody, you're in prison with 50-year-olds. It's a scary place to be. We didn't really have adolescents. Teens were not treated different. You were an adult. And really, even young children were treated as an adult during this time period. So this is an important reform. Education reform. You have your first teachers training schools. You have schools for girls. We're going to begin to teach girls in a more formal manner. School for the blind. You also have schools for the deaf. We're going to expand public education, and a lot of this has to do with the immigrants coming in. We need to use education as a way to assimilate, teach English, teach them our culture and our values. Founding liberal arts colleges like Oberlin. Oberlin is going to be a college that accepts women and African Americans. So again, you see the expansion of education to include more than just white men. Utopian societies. Perfect societies are a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, none of them seem to last, and probably because they're not very perfect. these tended to be religious, based on religious or philosophical ideas. Probably one of the best ones to me is the Shakers, faith-based society. They prohibited marriages and having children, and really, if you're prohibiting marriage, you're prohibiting sex, thus no children. Lasts a lot longer than you'd think it would, though. But a lot of people convert and move into these communities, and they also adopt. But of course, it doesn't last long, but it lasts longer. Then you have the workers' rights movements. These are your early unions, and I say early unions. The Panic of 1837 is going to stall the movement because people begin to fear losing their jobs. Workers are still at the mercy a lot of times of the owners, of the management. So, but you begin to see advocacy of better working conditions. It's terrible working conditions, better pay, shorter work days. The idea that you could strike to get what you want, and we'll talk about unions more again in chapter 5. The reform movements that I'm concerned about and that you need to be concerned about were chapter 3. One is the abolition movement. You need to know that abolition just means to do away with, but specifically if we're talking about the abolitionist movement, we're talking about the movement to abolish slavery. This is going to divide the North and the South. But I don't want you to look at this as a simple division. Most Northerners do not support abolition. Most Northerners fear the end of slavery. They don't want it to expand, but they fear the end of slavery. The thought is that if we free the slaves, they leave the South, they'll come north for jobs, and they'll take our jobs, or they'll get jobs and they'll depress our wages. The same reason they feared immigration. And so most Northerners are not abolitionists, but even the abolitionists, they couldn't agree on how to do it. Some just want to free the slaves, but they don't believe in, equal rights. So, there's a lot going on here. It's a very complex issue. The abolitionists had various methods. William Lloyd Garrison is going to publish an abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and he's going to found the American Anti-Slavery Society. And if you look at his quote, you can see here that he is against slavery in all aspects. There must be no compromise with slavery, none whatever. Nothing is gained, everything is lost by subordinating principle to expedience. You can kind of gather here that he is not a fan probably of Henry Clay, the great compromiser. The Grimke sisters are from South Carolina. They are from a slaveholding family, and they're going to speak at the anti-slavery conventions. They give a different perspective of slavery, as from a slaveholding family, but also as women. It was not uncommon for the slaves to bear a striking resemblance to their to the owners, and in this case, you're looking at the fact of these girls' father, and the idea of what this means to their mother, and there's so much exploitation, and the slavery itself is horrible. I'm just going to leave it at that. But so they gave a very different point of view than a man from New England. Frederick Douglass had yet another view and a different way of fighting it. He himself is a former slave who ran away. He actually describes it in his autobiography in that he stole himself. But he runs away. He has a great, great story. If you ever get a chance to read his autobiography, and what he went through just to learn how to read and to write. And he talked about the conditions that he had seen. It is a wonderful autobiography. But once he escaped north, he is going to publish an abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, and he spoke at anti-slavery conventions. He is going to, during the Civil War, meet and advise, to a degree, the president, Abraham Lincoln. You have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Abraham Lincoln, when he met her, said, so this is the woman who started a war. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, so many stereotypes here. And you begin to see Americans looking at the other side as, oh, this is the way the North sees us. Oh, this is the way the South sees us. And very little give and take. And you can begin to see that compromise is going to become tough. A lot of Northerners for the first time read a book that talked about slavery, and they began to think about it. They began to equate slavery with evil. And Simon Legree, the owner, is truly an evil character here. And it itself doesn't end slavery, but it kind of puts it into the conversation, I guess, is the best way of putting that. It was an amazing book. It did a lot for the cause of abolition. Harriet Tubman is one of those who returned south. She escaped and she kept coming back. Various accounts of how many she saved, how many trips. I've always read 19 trips. But regardless, she keeps coming back south. Very dangerous for her. If she's caught, she's killed. But it was just amazing. The fact that she's able to save as many people as she did. Now, you have more than 4 million slaves at this time, and she's thought to have saved around, helped escape around 200. Is that a huge number compared to the number of slaves? No. She is not the only conductor on the Underground Railroad, but I think the idea here is how many, or just the sacrifice, of what you're willing to do. And finally, you have John Brown. He is a true believer. He is a zealot in this cause. He is going to lead the Potawatomi Massacre, which we'll talk about, along with the Harper's Ferry raid, which we'll talk about in Chapter 4. So I'm not really going to get into that. I just want you to have that there. But their methods included overall publishing and writing in newspapers, journals, books, giving speeches, and violence. John Brown is the one who advocated violence. And there he is, John Brown, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here's a picture of a young Harriet Tubman. I believe I read where the year she died was the year that Rosa Parks was born. So kind of an interesting connection in history. Of course, not everyone, I said this earlier, supported abolition, primarily Southerners who see this as a threat to their way of life. And they're going to equate slavery with Northern wage earners, and they call them the wage slave, and say, oh, we treat our slaves better than these wage earners, these industrial workers are treated in factories. And they try to portray the happy slave, that they have a good life, they have a place to live, they have food, they have clothes. They don't really get into, again, the exploitation and the fact that they're, many of them aren't fed enough, don't get good medical care. And the fact that they live in these small slave cabins, several families in one, and that tuberculosis or various other illnesses and disease just kind of sweep through them. They're very contagious diseases. So the Southerners are going to look at the positives, as you can imagine they would. In the North, like I said, they're worried about their jobs. This is a threat to employment. Abolitionists were not popular in the North nor the South. In the North, they faced violence and persecution. And in here you see this destruction by fire of Pennsylvania Hall. There was a abolitionist convention here, and those who opposed abolition, again, Pennsylvania. We're not talking about Richmond, Virginia. They're going to burn it down. Arguments against abolition and women's rights tended to follow the same pattern. Some Southerners say blacks are incapable of taking care of themselves and were better off as slaves, and a lot of people also said that women were incapable of taking care of themselves and were better off being protected from the world. And this is going to be this that kind of out of the abolitionist movement is born the women's rights movement. You do see some supporters of abolition fighting for, or at least advocating for, equality of the sexes. The Grimke sisters, Sojourner Truth, and one of the few men is Frederick Douglass. Women did not have access to education. Most did not. I mean, they got some places provided women or girls with a rudimentary education, reading and writing, enough to run a household. But women were not allowed into colleges or anything like that. Women could not participate in the political process. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They just had no say. In these factories, if they did the same job as a man, they made a lot less money. They couldn't own property. Some places they couldn't own property, and some places they could inherit property. The problem is that as soon as you got married, anything you had, it became your husband's, regardless of whether it was yours, whether you bought it. It just became your husband. And divorce was difficult to obtain, but divorce actually hurt women. When they left a marriage, everything in that marriage belonged to the man, and when they left that marriage, they left all of the property. There was no splitting of assets. There was no alimony. Children were considered property of a marriage, and so when a divorce occurred, the woman left with nothing, including the children. Okay, no visitation rights or anything like that. So divorce tended to be rare. Not to say it didn't happen, it just tended to be rare. The women's rights movement is going to be born out of the abolitionist movement because in 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton tried to attend an abolitionist convention in London, but was prohibited. Tough conversations, tough topics are talked about: sexual abuse, sexual molestations, rape, physical violence against slaves. These are things, women are too delicate to handle these kind of conversations, so we can't let them attend. So at that point, you began to see some movement toward women's rights, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott are going to organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Now, you need to know the Seneca Falls Convention. This is the birth of the women's rights movement, and they're going to draft the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, and it's going to be based on the Declaration of Independence. And again, we see that declaration coming back up, and the ideals expressed in it are going to be a reason and a fight for civil rights, in this case for women. The two pillars of the women's rights movement were abolition and temperance, and again, they can equate or at least relate their status with that of slaves. And when I say temperance, they look at the family. Women supported family values, and alcohol is detrimental to the family, and so they're going to begin to work on that temperance movement. So all of those are related. That's the end of chapter 3. If you have any questions, you need to come and see me, come talk to me, send me a message somehow or another. Also take the quiz, the warm-up for today's lecture, and be prepared for your vocabulary quiz and your test, okay?